Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about education, community, and care. On the show today, I'm joined by the Belgium-based designer, educator, and researcher Annelys de Vet. From 2009 to 2019, Annelys was the head of the design program at the Sandberg Instituut and is the editor of Design Dedication, Adaptive Strategies for Design Education, a new book that collects the work, thinking, and methodologies of the program during her tenure. I read this book earlier this summer, and it's easily one of the best books on design education that I've read in the last few years. I just loved how she thinks about design and design education, and also how the students thought about their education and the expansiveness of what a design program can be. Now, Annelys is heading up a new master's program at Sandberg called Disarming Design that is committed to design practices in systems of oppression, and she's also working on a PhD. In this conversation, we talk a lot about education. We talk about the importance of thinking about design education as a system for community and for care. At the beginning of each semester, Annelys invites the new students to her home to stay for a week where they live and cook and eat and farm together. These weeks, in many ways, set the tone for the students' time in school. We also talk about thinking about structuring an expansive curriculum that leaves room for flexibility, experimentation, and inquiry, as well as giving students the tools, not necessarily to make projects, but to build a practice. I completely loved this conversation and find the way Annelys thinks about this work really, really inspiring and interesting. And I was so glad to have her on the show to talk about it all. Remember, Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you. If you enjoy this show and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter written by me, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes. If you like the show and you want to see it continue, please consider becoming a supporting member. It truly means so much to me. It really helps keep the podcast going. For all the details, you can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members. Thank you as always for listening, and here is my conversation with Annelys de Vet. In the introduction to Design Dedication, the new book that you edited about the design program at the Sandberg Instituut, you write, and I'm going to quote you here for a second, as a department, we hope to provide a space for young people to prepare for a practice within a profession that is increasingly hard to define. Design today is not about forms or things, but about a mentality and an understanding of the context and underlying structures. Our students graduate not with a design object or style, but with a practice. And if I wasn't already on board with your kind of pedagogical philosophy when I read that sentence, I was 100% behind you. And I want to start by talking about that. I feel like we could have a whole conversation just about, those two sentences there. There's so much packed into that. I want to start by this idea of students graduating not with an object or style, but with a practice. Can you talk about a little bit more about what that means to you and kind of what that looks like?
So the Sandberg master students, they graduate, with, I would say it's a DNA of a practice. So during their studies at the masters, they question more like, where do they stand? What kind of position do they want to take as a designer, also as a citizen? Like what for them is of value in the society we live in, and how would they like to relate to that through their, let's say, artistic practice? So they develop all kind of works, projects, collaborations, and a certain project is being dive deepen into it, and that becomes then a graduation project. So there is something, but I wouldn't say it's about the physical representation of the thing or the space or the text or the environment, but it's really about it underlines like how do they present themselves as designers in society. Like how would they like to use their artistic practice to reflect to the developments that happen around them, and to which kind of developments do they want to commit to, relate to, invest in, and how can they do that through ways of designing, which could also be video, writing, talking, interviewing. Some are more performance based, but it derives from a design discourse. And what you see is that a lot of graduates, they start their own practices. Sorry, maybe you hear chickens on the background.
I thought so.
I'll close the door.
No, it's fine. You write about the chickens in the book too, so it's perfect.
No, what you see is that they start their own practice, which can be individually, can be collective, it can have different forms. But what's important is that they, with their practice, that they contribute to the values that they care about, and that they don't become submissive to the system, or that they don't become obedient to submissive systems that they actually would like to fight against. Right. So that they're able to, or that they're equipped with the skills to set up their own practice and their own position in society that can contribute to the systems they want to contribute to.
I love that. And I think so much of, and this is a little bit of a blanket statement, but I think so much of design education often doesn't hit at that part about citizenship and about what are your values. And design education, perhaps more so undergrad design education, and again, I'm generalizing here, is setting students up for a system, for that kind of submissive system that you're talking about. And I'm interested in how, obviously you're working with master's students, and this program is a master's program, but you also write in the book about the kind of flexibility of the curriculum and the kind of open-endedness. And you were just speaking to students' work sometimes taking the form of writing or performance or video. How can you talk about kind of the, I don't mean to be reductive here, but the only word I can think of is process. Can you talk about what that looks like for a student to kind of come into the program, start to identify values, and then think about how can I make things in response to that? How do you start to think about kind of helping students articulate what those values even are for themselves?
Well, first of all, the moment people are accepted, they already have an application in which you feel that there's a sense of urgency or a sense of engagement with the world around them, expressed through their design work. So in that sense, we already work with when we start, it's already like a unique group with different backgrounds, different lived realities, different skills, sometimes different generations, different levels of experience. So just by this group coming together, that's immediately also a confrontation of your own ideas with the ideas of the other. And so as an education, I think we don't provide specific knowledge, but we provide an environment in which knowledge can take place, or in which knowledge development can take place, in which meeting each other takes place. So that's the core, to see like, who are these people? How can they get to know each other? How can they get to know each other's skills? So immediately they learn from each other. They see what the other is doing, and that's very motivating and inspiring. And then in the first year, some people work much on their own research, or there's a specific project or specific topic that they're really interested in and that they want to explore further and further. And we pose questions, provide resources, or connect them, or there's also all kind of resources within the school itself that they can use. Other people are more kind of open, or do maybe 20 projects in 1 year. So it depends very much on the desire and the character and the mentality of the student itself. But there's no prescripted expectation. The expectation is commitment and participation. But how? That is up to the student how to develop that. And also to allow discussions to take place, to see like, how can we develop a safe space for the students to express themselves in, and then what is safe for one student doesn't mean that it's also safe for the other. So it's also a conversation that takes place to see like, how do you feel, and so there's group meetings, but there's also a lot of individual meetings. And the focus is not so much on the final product, but much more on the process. Like, what do you want to achieve, what you want to do. So sometimes there's a certain topic or a certain question that occupies the students. And some people, they think really through the making, and they make a lot, they experiment a lot, and then we talk about what comes out. So it's not about solving problems, but it's really about finding out what you care about, what excites you, what is it that you want to learn and develop.
I have a somewhat selfish question, because I also work with graduate students and hope to kind of provide a similar experience that you are doing. And I think you're speaking to things that I'm very interested in, whether that's around kind of ideas of community and making the classroom a safe space, having students kind of find their values, work through their values, and how that manifests itself in making or in quote unquote design. And something that I think about a lot is, how do I essentially lower my position in the class so I am equal with the students? Because what I find happen, and some of that could be cultures of the programs, the type of student, is that students take my feedback more seriously than feedback of others. And I'm just one person. And sometimes midway through a semester, a student knows more about their research than I do. And so I guess the question that I'm asking is, can you talk a little bit about, or I'm curious about, those discussions and ideas around critique, and how you talk about work where students are bringing a really diverse set of values, a diverse set of processes, working on a diverse set of projects. How do you talk about them in such an individualized way in a group setting like that? You know what I mean?
Well, there's a variety of aspects, I think, that influence the development of this. So I think for the first thing is also like, in which space are you and how do the bodies move in the space? Like, is it already in hierarchical setting, you as a tutor and the students as students, or is it more the way the bodies move already more non-hierarchical? I would always long for that, for more non-hierarchical settings within the space. Yeah. Also, the question is, should it be in the educational room? Is it a comfortable room, or isn't it nicer in someone's house or outside in the park? Could it be while walking instead of sitting around? So, like, the way bodies relate to each other influences a lot the sense of hierarchy. Then I recognize the kind of natural longing from students that they take the feedback of the tutor more serious than the feedback of their fellow students. Well, I think it should be the other way around.
Yeah.
And so therefore, often also I avoid giving feedback. I think it's so much more interesting to ask the others for feedback, but to moderate the conversation that takes place, or to stimulate people to give feedback to each other. Because by articulating feedback to somebody else's work, sometimes that's the most learningful experience. And as a tutor, you can kind of structure or manipulate who is speaking or how long or to which topic to dive into. But it's way more interesting if the students say it themselves than you as a tutor say it, because then you indeed immediately, your words have more authority than the words of the students. So I think that's very important. And then also there's the question of, when you're together in a group, like, what kind of feedback do you give that's shared with the whole group? And when you have an individual meeting, the tone of voice and the things that you share amongst each other can be very different. So I think it's very easy to kind of give critique or to say what's wrong. But what's way more of value and sometimes way more challenging to articulate is, what is the quality of something? Why is something good? Or what makes you? Where do you see potential? What's interest? Or what do you think can really grow? And there's a Dutch artist who I often quote, which I find such a brilliant quote. It's Willem de Ridder. He used to make radio programs in the Netherlands. He's a bit esoteric. And then in one conversation, which is about esotericism. So in this radio broadcast is about esoteric topics, and he kind of says, like, everything where you put energy in, that grows. So don't put energy in problems. And to me, it's kind of a very interesting quote in thinking about education. So I really want to put energy in the things I want to let grow. And that is also maybe for the things I do in my own practice, but also in the way I teach, the way I deal with people. Like, energy make things grow. And so what do you want to let grow? And those are the things that have potential, or that are interesting, or that are yet unknown, but you feel it shakes you. And often critiquing, saying this is wrong or this doesn't work, derives often also from the things you already know, or from the prescripted settings of your way of thinking, and it gives less space for the new or the unknown, or the exploration of new languages, new forms, new kind of projects, also for the students themselves. So I think it's really interesting to open up the imagination, to also to motivate the students to say, hey, there is a tremendous potential. What you say there to me is really interesting. Could you explain that further, or explore that further? And things that are wrong is not so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of exactly what I was thinking about it as you were answering the previous question, and something that I've been thinking about a lot about kind of in the classroom setting is that idea of encouraging the students to how do you facilitate a discussion for students that moves beyond what often becomes I don't know, superficial critique about what is right or wrong, or even becomes kind of performative in some way. A student wants to kind of show that they, are well read or know something, and kind of, it becomes more about, you know what I mean? It becomes more about the student kind of presenting than about the work that's kind of under analysis. And I don't mean to be too prescriptive here, but I kind of want to know what that looks like for you. And so you're talking about changing the setting. You're talking about one-on-one discussions that take place over walks. Can you talk about this idea? And this is something that's clearly important to you, and something that you think about a lot. And it comes up in the book again, about ideas of kind of designing community, designing care, designing trust, designing a place for these things to happen. I guess I have two questions. The first is, how did you start to kind of arrive at these ideas? And then two, what do those look like for you as a teacher? How do you actually kind of think about creating space for community and trust and care, and space for people to bring them full selves to the work?
Well, first, when I started as a head of the design master, so that's now 11 years ago, I was really thinking, I was questioning myself, what would have been the most learningful experiences that I had while being a student. And I felt that the most valuable moments took place outside the institutional moments, and sometimes also outside the institutional space. Though you still do need this setting to have this inside and outside, or a moment to come together, or maybe something to be against. But I felt like doing the excursions, doing visits to other places, or the moment the tutors had left, we stayed in the building. We had 24-hour access. We ordered pizzas, and at those moments, those unplanned moments, were the most interesting conversations. Then maybe the space became more of a safe space, and we talked about each other's work without having an aim or a specific goal or a specific focus. But it's really, I would say, informal or spontaneous conversations, and that was very truthful or sincere. And those were also the things that entered to me most deeply, or became most transformative, those moments. So I was also wondering, if I'm heading the master program, how can I generate these kind of moments? How can I make sure that there's enough space for these informal moments, or outside the curriculum or outside the building, which also needs to be in the right balance, because sometimes I gave too much space and people felt, hey, this education is nothing.
Right.
and then when I programmed too much, they felt like, hey, I want to have my own agency. Yeah. So there is a sense of, and 1 year, that balance is different than the other year. So it requires to really listen to the students, and to have conversations with the students, like, how do you perceive the program? How do you perceive the space? How do you perceive the way feedback is given? So in order to adapt to the sensitivities or the dynamics in the group. One of the things that I've done actually every year while heading the department is in the beginning of the year, I invited all the students to my own house.
Right.
I live in a farm in Belgium, and I invited them for a week to come over. And sometimes that was the first moment people met each other. And then it's a completely there. Everyone is uncomfortable. I mean, even though I'm inviting them, I feel very uncomfortable when they enter my house. They feel uncomfortable that they're in the private house of a tutor. They feel uncomfortable maybe sharing the places. But we have to go through that. We have to. Then we start cooking together, we start talking together, people start to introduce themselves, conversations arise, we walk, or we throughout the years I focused more and more on sensorial experiences because I felt that had the most magical impact, more than like really content driven activities. So the latest years we harvested walnuts, we picked berries in the forest, we made our own bread. And while doing these things, really interesting conversations came up, and particularly because our students come from really different backgrounds and different regions in the world. So they also grew up with very different rituals, very different ways of dealing with food or dealing with urban or rural realities. And while making bread or walking in the forest, these conversations opened up. And that became really interesting to see, hey, how do you relate, and what did your parents do, or why did you choose for the Sandberg? And then there was the conversation on food, and then it also allowed space and context for students to how do you say, to blossom, or to really, like, some were really entertaining, some were really funny, some were very good chefs, some were very uncomfortable, but they are amazing designers. So there's
Right.
really different kind of realities, different kind of context for students to exist in. And so you find different, you see or witness really different qualities of people. And there, friendships were born, or ideas were born for new collaborations or new works, without kind of the pressure of an assignment or solving something, but really arrived out of curiosity to each other. And I felt that was really valuable. So that in 1 week, I got to know the students much better than it would take maybe a year within the educational building. And also the students got to know each other much better. And there was a sense, it contributed to a sense of trust amongst each other in the group, in discussing each other's work, in setting up initiatives, and also to stimulate students to cook at their own houses and invite other students, or to see education not just within the educational building, but to see education really maybe as an opportunity to live together, or to think of different ways of living together.
That's exactly where I kind of wanted to take the conversation next. And so I'm glad that you brought it up, because that was the other big piece of the book that I found myself thinking about a lot after, is this idea that at the beginning of each year, you invite all the students to your farm to, essentially live there for a week and live together and cook and go on walks and farm. And I was thinking about reading that. I was thinking about my own grad school experience, where we, throughout the semester, the program director would invite all of us to her house, just for a
Nice.
day. And there was no activities, there was no structure. It was just, let's all hang out at my house today. It was usually after a workshop or something like that. And those are my fondest memories of grad school. And so many of the conversations that happened there ended up manifesting themselves in the work, not on purpose, not because we were trying to talk about our work, but that change in environment, that change in atmosphere changed how we related to each other. And so that was just, one day every couple months. And so I can't imagine how much that's amplified when it takes place over a week. How did that, can you talk more about how that kind of changes the tone of the rest of the the rest of the year? I imagine that there's something almost utopian or idyllic about that, of living on a farm and cooking together and eating together and walking together when they return to school. And I don't mean to make that sound so like that thing ends and the other one begins, but when they then go into working, how does that week, how do you see that week kind of filtering into the rest of the year?
Um, Yeah, it's a bit hard to answer in the sense that I witnessed, but it's
Yeah.
more to this to the students to really kind of express what impact it has. But I do, hear them sometimes talking back about these experiences. But
Mm,
what I can witness is that certain conversations started during this week and they continue. So the moment you're back in the school building, there's still this energy of that week. But during the week, it's also a lot about taking care of each other. Once B was a Chinese student. She broke her leg while dancing just the day before the trip. So we hiked and we really had to take care of her and carry her all the
oh
time.
wow.
And she was partly on while we walked in the forest. She was partly on the pony, so she didn't need to walk on her foot. But somehow, immediately, it breaks down the convention, or it breaks down the
Yeah.
expectation you have, or how to relate to each other. Also, it becomes very bodily because people had to carry her up, or also with cooking. Yeah, and then sometimes, ask the students to help or to initiate the dinner. And then, people often bring the recipes or bring the tastes
Mm,
from their homes.
mhm.
So that opens up really interesting conversations. And often, there's always a couple of people who are really interested in food and ingredients. And that continues at the Sandberg Institute. Also, there's a big kitchen at the Sandberg Institute. So it also invites or gives the opportunity for students to cook or to make things.
Yeah.
And I love that, to really think about also the food, the cooking. So there's this sense of cooking, but also organizing dinner parties, inviting each other. I also remember once I invited people to come during this week and speak about their work or speak about a certain topic. So we sat around the fireplace and someone was speaking, and then there were a conversation. So it was really different than an invited guest at the school building, which is immediately kind of hierarchical and also has a clear starting point and a clear ending point. And here the guest would also join the dinner. The conversation continued. And I loved that so much. So then Arthur Röring-Beyer, a German-Swedish student, then started the quicksand lectures. He said, well, this
Mm,
is what we should do at the Sandberg. We as students should also invite guests and have dinner with them at school. And
mhm.
so since then, we have this student-run lecture series. So we have a certain part of the budget free for the students in order for them to set up their own lecture series in a way they want. So that was kind of very concrete that came out of the week, and that continued. Often, so and then there's all kind of things, but I think what's maybe most important is the sense of to get to know each other on a better way,
Yeah.
to see
Yeah.
the different qualities of people, see different ways of being, and therefore it opens also more your ways of thinking, or your daring to fail, or the ways of expressing yourself also in very vulnerable ways, to allow that to happen. And I think that's maybe the most important thing, that it's the moment you get to know each other better, there's more exchanges, the more vulnerable you dare to be within the group, and also the
Yeah.
more space you allow to fail. And I think that's really important, that everything you can fail. It's not about success, and that you feel safe within that environment.
I have a question that I'm almost embarrassed to ask a little bit. I'm like self-conscious to ask this question because I feel like I don't mean to cheapen what you're saying, but I'm thinking about what you were saying at the beginning of the conversation and thinking about students' work in the program taking a variety of forms, whether that's writing or video, but kind of using a design lens necessary, more so than thinking about creating design projects. And also in the book, I'm thinking of, I think it was Daniel van der Velden who said something about the program really defends the act of making and making
Mm-hmm.
sure that students have time to make, in a world where they constantly have to kind of be presenting themselves, writing emails, doing kind of administrative
Yes.
things. And I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about your earlier point about students' work taking a variety of forms. And I'm thinking about this idea of organizing student run lectures and cooking dinner for each other. And I'm curious about do you think about, and I don't mean for you to speak to the students, does the program think about, or is there thought around what is considered work and what is considered not work? You know what I mean? Because like I'm hearing students organize a lecture, or I'm hearing students putting together dinner for each other, and part of me thinks like, oh, that's interesting just in and of itself. Like, is that you know what I mean? Like, I don't mean to say this is now a project, but how do you think about that kind of fluidity between what I'm going to call projects or the practice and just living? Does that make sense? You know what I
Yes,
mean?
yeah, but I think there it's super interesting because the moment you think, oh, is it organizing a dinner, a project or not? I think there is also comes back your question about feedback. In a sense, because this organizing a dinner doesn't allow such a feedback session. It's really a way of being. And maybe
Right.
that's the most interesting thing, because then it is about initiating, it is about
Yeah.
communication, it is about organizing, or as a designer also being a host or thinking about hosting and what does it mean hosting.
Hmm.
And it's these are qualities that as a designer you can really or do from also from a designer point of view, or through a design lens, and you practice
Hmm.
it kind of intuitively, but through it you recognize other structures. So you think, hey, maybe it's instead of organizing an exhibition, maybe we should organize a dinner, or maybe it should take another form. But you need to go through these experiences, or really allow the work or the material or allow the setting to speak to you, instead of having an idea first and then execute the idea, which yeah, it's also often based on things you already know. So how can you allow the energy of the work, the energy of the meeting, or the energy of the community, how can you allow that to drive you forward in next decisions? And often people also ask themselves like, yeah, but what does it mean for my practice after Sandberg, or how can I make money with that? How can I sustain myself? And of course, this is kind of a recurring question, but I do believe like the more you do the more you're able to do what you think is of value, the more uh, request there will be. It doesn't make sense to do what is already being done. I think there's much more interest in finding new spaces, or perhaps discovering that you're not interested in design at all, that actually, yeah, you really want to become a writer or filmmaker, or
Right.
yeah, that's not up to the education. I think that's up to you to discover. And these 2 years are ways to discover that. And so, particularly in the first year, we really try to stimulate the students not to think about the future in that sense, but to really allow processes to take place. And more in the second year to think about, well, how can you, with these experiences, or with these initiatives or things that you did, how can that be translated to a practice, or how can you use
Mhm.
that on other ways?
I think that's exactly right. And I think that speaks so much to my experience, both when I was a graduate student and now my experience as a teacher, in that as we talked about before we hit record, my my graduate school project was a podcast, and I thought a lot about, is this design? Is this am I still a designer? And I kind of had self-identified as a designer for many years, and part of that project and part of the work that I've done since is this kind of slow realization that being a designer in the traditional sense is not actually the thing that's interesting to me. It's these conversations, it's being in the classroom, it's writing. And I still approach all of those through the lens of being a designer, through the experience of being a designer. I still kind of think of those activities, even though they're not maybe what we traditionally think of as graphic design. I still think about them as acts of design. And I see this with my students all the time, who are kind of making really interesting work, and they'll ask like, is this design though? Like, I feel like I'm just making art. And that's like that they see that as a bad thing. And I'm always want to be like, who cares? It doesn't matter like what you call it. And then they're like, well, how am I going to get a job? And I don't have a good answer for that. And I was kind of curious, how do you have those types of discussions? How do you talk about kind of letting go of these identities, or of these kind of preconceived boundaries that we sometimes have to create kind of the practice that is so individualized? That was a big question. I'm sorry.
Now, yeah, a few thoughts crossed my mind. So when you talk about the question, is it still design or not? Then you can also question, do you think if the output manifests itself as design, or is it more your mentality, a way of thinking, a way of looking?
Mm,
So I think it's too limited to only look at the output or to look at the medium. I think it's
right.
really, design can be also very miscellaneous or untouchable. Design can also be a way of thinking, or a way of dealing with each other, or a way of hosting. So and also, as you said, whether it's design or not, whether it's art or not, that's not that's not an interesting question, or that's
Right.
not a relevant question. I think what's relevant is more, what would you like to achieve with it, and what if your students, as you describe in this example, say, oh, is it still design or not, then they're also based their thinking very much on an expectation that they
Right.
have of something already existing. So they try to fit themselves into a certain system or into a certain expectation. And I think there, is in essence problematic, because then you reaffirm the systems that are maybe even ruling us, or that are already existing.
Right.
And how can you as a designer contribute to different ways of living, or different ways of world making? And then you
Right.
have to let go of your existing definitions, unless you want to become a very commercial designer and contribute for neoliberal capitalistic structures and flash magenta-colored marketing campaigns. It could be a
Right.
choice. But personally, I would like to stay out of those systems. And then
Yeah.
you really also
Yeah.
have to relate to maybe unknown systems, or to really see like, how can education be liberating and be emancipating.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's kind of like very helpful just for me personally, as I kind of think about working with my students, because these questions come up and they ask like, how am I going to get a job? And it's actually, I'm embarrassed that I haven't thought about it that way. And it's like, well, you're here in grad school because you wanted to do something different, most likely. And so why would you make work that will then just get you another job at, whatever branding agency? You're here obviously because there's something else you want.
But the American system is also different than the European system, or
Right.
particularly also in the Netherlands and Belgium, where I can relate to directly. Like the height of the depth of students who
Mm,
graduate in the States is way more bigger than here.
right. Right.
And if you say, because I believe education should be liberating, should be emancipating, should contribute to new ways of being together, new ways of world making. But the moment you graduate with the tremendous debt, you're kind of forced to function into a capitalist neoliberal structure in order to
Right.
get rid of your debt. And I think that's very problematic with the finance and the neoliberalization of education, that kind of prevents it from being liberating, because you really indeed have this tremendous burden on your shoulders when you graduate to pay off the bills.
I mean, can we, and I realize that there is a difference between kind of the European models and the United States models, but I'm interested in how you think about this in your practice outside of teaching, because your practice is also something, I think it's very connected to what you're talking about in the classroom, in that it is kind of looking at these systems and critiquing these systems and working around and outside of these systems. How do you think about how these questions that arise in the classroom shape the other work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's not that one shapes the other, but it's not the other shapes also the other, or it's like they
Right,
also
right, right,
influence
right.
each other. But there was a certain moment in the development of my practice that I did realize that actually all the projects that I do are based upon collaboration and about
Mm,
communities, and also giving
mhm,
platform to underrepresented voices, or to really try to um, uh, articulate or visualize the voice from within. And so the bottom up experiences, or kind of lived knowledges, how to give platform to that as kind of an antidote to the magnetic images and stories that media, and particularly mass media, are reproducing. So how, as a designer, can I contribute to these other voices and these other sensitivities, or contribute to sensitivity about being in the world? And so kind of more unconsciously, that became more and more stronger in my practice. And also thinking about how to sustain myself. I've been in a very lucky position, starting my practice in the Netherlands and having also cultural and educational institutes that allowed how do you say, more experimental or more vulnerable projects to take place, and not graduating with such a big depth. But that's different now. Like in Europe, like particularly in the Netherlands, everyone is graduating with a big depth. And I graduated in 1999, so it was a different time.
Right.
And I thought it was interesting. Well, in the beginning of my practice, I was really questioning. I would like my work to have value, but I didn't know what I thought was of value. And through my practice, more and more, this defined itself. And then I was asked to give a workshop in Tallinn, in Estonia, in 2003. And then Estonia was just a member of the European Union, and I came up with the proposal to make a subjective atlas of the European Union from an Estonian point of view. And all of a sudden, it was a political question, but it was also a very playful question. It was collective. It was education. And somehow, after this book was made, I felt that everything kind of came together about politics, education, design practice, collectivity, and having this multi-layered visual conversation that speaks on a different way than than journalism does, or than books do, or to have its own niche in its way of expressing itself on a kind of an open way, not like it's their subjective atlases visualizing what it means to live on a certain place or region, seen from inside out through mappings, through graphs, through observations, and not through opinions. And that developed further. And then in 2007, I made a subjective atlas of Palestine. And I went to Palestine, to the West Bank, worked with a lot of Palestinian artists and designers. And that deeply opened my eyes and completely changed my practice in thinking about politics, in about the role of design in society, in the role of design as a form of resilience, as a form of resistance, and how our creative practices can be like deeply meaningful for also the person doing it, also for the kind of spaces that it creates, the stories that it narrates. And I felt that deeply affected me in thinking about also who I am as a white European privileged designer from the Netherlands, and how to relate to these different realities, cultures, problematics, how to relate to colonization, how to relate to racism, and how through creative practice can you resist on different ways with different languages. And that developed further.
This actually connects nicely to the new master's program that you started called Disarming Design,
yes.
Which seems like that program really is born out of your practice. Can you talk about what that program is and what that looks like, and maybe even how that's kind of different than Sandberg's other design program?
Yeah, so it's the Sandberg Instituut has main departments and temporary departments. Main departments accept students every year, and temporary departments exist only one time for 2 years and are more theme-based. So I got the opportunity to start a new temporary master's program, and the urge to do this is really rooted in all the experiences I've had in working in Palestine and with Palestinian artisans, designers, and artists. And really thinking about what can design contribute to self-empowerment, to emancipation, and how through design practices can you create autonomy? Can you contribute to liberation? And because, for instance, what I saw in Palestine, there are some really interesting designers, but there's not many spaces where they can have more autonomous practices. Often if your work really exists within Palestine, then often you need to work for commercial branding offices, or so then in a way you contribute to the systems that actually are the ones who oppress you or occupy you. And so how can you as a designer contribute to different systems of beings, different systems of relating to a place, relating to identity, and relating to decolonial practices? And also working together with the craftsmen and with the design history that's on a place, but which might not be recognized as design history or design discourse. How can you work with the specific localities and at the same time through an understanding of what design can do, set up other practices and set up actually new learning platforms for design. So this is the kind of the root of the new master's department. It's called Disarming Design, and it wants to equip the students with abilities to set up new platforms for design learning in oppressed or against oppressed situations. And how can you create these autonomous spaces in vulnerable political or social situations? And I believe that with a good network, with knowing each other, maybe manifesting yourself as a collective, or understanding how institutes work and to maybe work with institutes but not within institutes. So how can you create autonomy outside institute but still create a certain way of working and way of dealing that allows a certain sustainability for the space of design that you think is of value? So so this is the core of the program, or of the aim of the program. So we have accepted 17 students, of which five are Palestinian, 4 from Lebanon, there's 1 from the United Emirates, from the United States, from Estonia, from Spain, from Germany, from the Netherlands, Switzerland, and they all are very interested in collective practices, in design pedagogy, also in materiality, like how to speak and work and think through the materiality of things. So also through craftsmanship, through making, and also how can you relate to different backgrounds, different traumas, different ways of being, and in the spaces of making together, how can you find at that moment an equality or a different way to communicate with each other?
And are all of these students who are going to go through this program, do they come from design backgrounds, or kind of what kind of professional backgrounds do they have? Because I imagine this is something that could also be very diverse.
Yes, yeah. Now they all have a design background, but some come more from a video background, some from more crafts background, some more from a fashion background. There's a typographer, type designer from Cairo who has an amazing type practice. There's designers from Lebanon who are very skilled actually in screen printing. And during the revolution in Lebanon, and then they were in Beirut, they took their screen print equipment to the street, and people came with T-shirts and they screen printed logos for the revolution on the T-shirts on the spot. And so I find these ways of using design very interesting and relating to political discussions through design skills, and also with tool making. Who owns the tools? Who build the tools? What do we make? Where do the resources come from? And how can we question all these aspects in the process and make the right choices?
I have 2 more questions that are the 2 questions that I use to end many of these conversations. And you kind of were just speaking to the first question, but I'm interested in what's next for you, or what are you kind of thinking about now that's really consuming your interest?
Well, I also started a PhD this year, which is called Disarming Design from Palestine, and that wants to research what are the conditions for design pedagogy in situations of oppression, and that can contribute to emancipation. So it's a research that I will continue working on in the next years, and it's a practice-based PhD. So we hope to contribute to setting up a design school and design program in Palestine with my Palestinian colleagues, with who I set up a thought-provoking design label, Disarming Design from Palestine. And I hope that with the master students of the new Disarming Design Master, that it can really contribute to their the ideas that they will develop in thinking about how to set up new design platforms, and how with the master program can we contribute to providing skills, providing network, providing access, and thinking about how to empower these positions. At this moment, we're going through the whole process of them applying, getting a visa, and then non-EU students have to pay much more than EU students. In Lebanon, because of the revolution, the banks were closed, and then the students could not get bank statements, which is required in order to get a student visa. So there's a lot of administrative labor that's required, particularly from non-EU students, which is really unfair if you compare to the position of EU students. So this comes directly to what are the conditions of design education, who is able to access it and who's not able to access it, what does it require, and how can we change these conditions, and also how can we put the discussion about these discussions more on the table to understand that that design education is also a privileged place to be, and how can we make it more accessible and more open for people from different geographies, different backgrounds. So another aspect that I would like that I'm working on to setting up is a new publishing platform called Disarming Design, together with alumni of the Sandberg Instituut who developed the student-run publishing platform PUB. And then that will be rooted also in Palestine, and with the participants of the master education, to really think how can we use such a platform to share knowledge, to develop knowledge, and to empower these different positions, and also to stay outside capitalistic neoliberal structures. How can you organize such a practice?
Yeah, that's great. I'm so mad that you brought this up at the end of the conversation. I feel like we could talk about this for another hour. My last question is, I'm just curious what you're reading right now.
It is. I'm reading several books at the moment.
Okay.
Well, what I found a super interesting book is Design for the Pluriverse from Arturo Escobar. Yeah, he's a Colombian anthropologist and really looks at design, particularly for indigenous communities, or how. So he says, like, a main goal of the book is to ask whether design can actually contribute to enabling the communal forms of autonomy that underlie the transition visions of life projects. Or he really talks about how design is a reflection and also an influence on ways of being and ways of relating to each other. And so I think that's really interesting to think, the position of design in feeding culture, developing culture, maintaining culture, and what role does that play, and how can we enforce that space that design can take. And then I'm also reading Adrienne Mary Brown, Emergent Strategy. She's a Canadian activist, which I recently read an interview with her, and I thought it was really inspiring. It's about shaping change, changing worlds. So it's strategies for activism, but on a very lively, engaged way that she talks about it. I can definitely recommend, like, her book Emergent Strategy. I think it came out 3 years ago, and it seems to be really a bestseller. And she's also very inspired by Octavia Butler, and about how Octavia Butler is really about futurism and imagining different futures and different worlds. And so I think that's also interesting how literature can then also inform these positions of people who make and act. And so actually at the moment I'm also reading Octavia Butler, The Parable of the Sower.
Yeah, the Design for the Pluriverse has been recommended on the show before, and I have yet to pick it up, and so I feel like I need to get that one.
Yeah, and there's also a lecture by Arturo Escobar on YouTube, and it's amazing. Like, the lecture is called Design for the Pluriverse, and he kind of unveils what the book is about, and he talks about it very. I could absolutely recommend following the lecture on YouTube.
Okay, yeah, I'll add that to a link when this episode goes up too. This was such a great conversation. I feel like you helped me think through things that I was thinking about in my own work, and just kind of think about so many things in new and different ways. And I think the way you operate and the way kind of your tenure running the design program at the Sandberg Institute is so inspiring, and there's so much to kind of learn from in thinking about pedagogy and teaching and community and care. And I loved the book. I loved this conversation. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Jarrett.
This episode was recorded on July 30th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.